Hello and welcome to our Top Tips for Progress Reviews session. This recording is focused on Key Assessment Point 1. So you'll have a student teacher with you who's in Clinical Practice 1 about to complete their first progress review. The session aims are to get you prepared to complete that very first progress review with your student teacher. We're going to start off by talking about the STEEL descriptors, which you should be familiar with from completing your learning and teaching observation, and we're going to look at the KAP thresholds. So where do they need to be in relation to those STEEL descriptors in order to meet this key assessment point, the KAP? We're going to focus on the synthesis of progress that the student teachers complete. And then we're going to talk about the progress review meeting. So what is the process that you're going to go through and what is the threshold that we're looking for the student teachers to make? We're then going to have an orientation on the PLP. So we're going to open up the PLP and we're going to show you exactly where to find all these different things and which boxes you should be completing as a mentor. We're going to end off with some top tips. So our best bits of advice that will help you complete this progress review and for it to be a really successful experience for you and your student teacher. And there are also some additional supporting resources that we're going to signpost you to. So, without further ado, this is where we're going to start. The first resource that I'm sure you'll be very familiar with at this point is the Clinical Practice Guide. And everything that we refer to here, any documents, any tables, can all be found in that appendix, Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice, that can be found in the guide. So if ever you're unsure of anything or not sure where to find something, go to the Clinical Practice Guide and it will almost always be there. So to start with, let's talk about these STEEL descriptors again. So you're probably familiar with these already, but the trajectory that student teachers are working on roughly goes as follows. Most student teachers start off at unaware, at that very first threshold when they join us. Not all of them will be unaware, but mostly will expect to see that unaware threshold. They'll gradually move towards aware, and at Progress Review 1, this distinction between unaware and aware is probably the one that you're going to spend most of your time thinking about. Am I going to assess my student teacher as unaware or aware? As they move further on through their PGCE or their BA programme, we'll start to see more capable descriptors being achieved. And then towards the end of the programme, some student teachers will start to achieve QTS+. So what do these different descriptors look like? When a student teacher starts and is unaware, usually it means that they're relatively unaware of important information related to pedagogy and human development. There are going to be some big gaps in their knowledge, and they'll start to learn new facts and skills, they'll start to attempt some things and understanding will increase, but on the whole, there's a lot that they just don't know. And sometimes student teachers being assessed at unaware can find that to be quite a negative thing. They feel like, oh, I'm unaware, I should know this stuff. But actually, when they're beginning, we wouldn't expect them to know all the things that a qualified teacher knows. So it's perfectly normal to be assessing your student teacher as unaware at the beginning of their programme. As they start to develop their skills and start to learn more, we move to aware. And this is probably where some of your student teachers are at this point. So they're halfway through their first placement, they're beginning to master the concepts, theories, and context-specific information, but they're not yet able to independently and confidently apply these. So ideas and techniques are started to be put into action, but often that's requiring a lot of scaffolding from you. Maybe you're having to provide an awful lot of guidance at this point. And perhaps sometimes things are going wrong. They're trying something out. It seems like a good idea, but it doesn't quite work out for them. And so that is the aware threshold. And this is probably the kind of debate that you're going to be having with yourself is my student teacher unaware in the standard, or actually are they showing elements of aware and I can assess them as aware? As they move on through their programme, we'll start to get more capables. Now, it's not that you definitely won't have any capables at KAP1, but probably that's going to be your kind of exceptional student teacher. Most student teachers will be around the kind of aware mark, probably with some unawares there as well. But it could be that you're starting to think about, actually, are they capable in this standard? Maybe you've got a student teacher with a lot of experience prior to joining their programme. And when they're capable, the student teacher still needs to concentrate a lot. They're still having to focus more than a qualified teacher would. But they're becoming increasingly comfortable with a growing repertoire of skills. And this is the stage that they need to get to by the end of their PGCE or their BA programme. So at this point, when they're roughly a quarter of the way through, it is absolutely fine that they're not achieving this kind of capable level. So this is where we'd be looking towards maybe at the third and the fourth progress review. And then finally, we've got QTS+. This is in line with the induction descriptors of the PSTL. Things are very firmly embedded and consistent. I'd say it's unlikely that you're going to have anyone at this point achieving QTS+, but that's where we're headed to. And here we've got our little table, which can be found in the clinical practice guide, which has got some really useful adjectives. So if we look at the aware column to start with, we've got words like underdeveloped, lacking rigour, superficial, poor quality. And this is where we might expect student teachers to be at the very beginning of their journey. They don't know a lot of stuff, so what they're doing isn't necessarily going to be of the best quality. Perhaps it's going to be unsuccessful, perhaps it's going to be ineffective. But then as we look to aware, the aware column, you can see words like developing, inconsistent, with support, improving, some success. And so this is the thought process that you're going to be going through at this point. Was that technique that they tried unsuccessful, or actually did they have some success with it? Did they try doing a little bit of questioning? And actually they weren't mainly successful with that, but there was some success. They ascertained some information about the learning that had happened. Not as much perhaps as you would expect from a qualified teacher, but you can see that they're aware of that technique and they're starting to have some success with it. So this is the threshold that you're probably going to be debating in your head for this progress review. Are they unaware in this standard and are they aware? Or are they aware? And these adjectives should really help you. And you can also look back to your learning and teaching observations as well. You should have been using the language of the STEEL descriptors. Are you using the language of unaware or aware when you're describing the practice that you're seeing in their classroom? As we then move across, I'm not going to dwell too much on capable and QTS+, because most of us are going to be in that unaware-aware column. But you can see words like mainly impactful, mainly independent, mainly secure. So it could be that there are certain aspects of the PSTL that you think, actually, they've really got that. They've really nailed that area. And note the use of the word mainly. It doesn't need to be 100% consistent for capable. And then in that final column there, you've got the descriptors associated with QTS+ that probably we're not going to be looking at all for this progress review. So what is our threshold for this key assessment point? So we are at the midpoint of clinical practice 1. So our 4 progress reviews that we have, we've got one at the midpoint of clinical practice 1, which is KAP1, where we are today. Then you'll have one at the end of clinical practice 1, which is KAP2. And then we have exactly the same for clinical practice 2. So we've got one at the midpoint, which is KAP3, and one at the end point, which is KAP4. And the threshold that we're working to today, so at the midpoint of clinical practice 1, the students need to be achieving aware against the 10 critical descriptors. So the 10 critical descriptors are highlighted in yellow in the clinical practice guide and also on the PLP when you get the drop down there. So the professional standards for teaching and leadership, the ones that are highlighted yellow, are the 10 critical descriptors, and those are the ones that the student teachers need to be aware in. Everything else can be unaware. So your student teacher could have the 10 critical descriptors that are aware, and all the rest of them are unaware, and they've met that threshold. Probably it'll be a bit more of a mixed picture. Maybe they'll have 13 of them that are aware, and then the others will be unaware. It could be that they are aware in 20, say. But the critical thing is that those 10 critical descriptors need to be aware. If you've got a student teacher who is not achieving aware in one of those critical descriptors, you need to go and talk to your senior mentor. And not meeting the threshold means that the concern over progress process should be followed. They don't need to be doing more than 10, but if there's any one of those 10 criticals that isn't aware. So say they've got 15 awares, but there's 1 or 2 criticals that aren't aware, you still need to go to your senior mentor, because that means they haven't met the threshold. So that is what we're looking at here. They can be unaware in everything apart from the 10 criticals that need to be at aware. So let's have a look at what this looks like for the student teacher to complete a progress review. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to self-assess against all the QTS descriptors on the PLP. So there's a drop-down that they've got where they go through every single descriptor and they assess themselves. Are they unaware? Are they aware? Are they capable? Are they QTS plus? So the student teacher does that first of all. Then they complete a synthesis of progress, and I'm going to go into more detail of that on in the next slide. This is where they identify key areas of progress and targets for improvement. So the student teacher will complete these 2 steps on their own before they come to you as mentor. Then you'll see yourself highlighted in green there. The first thing that you need to do is review the student teacher's self-assessment and synthesis of progress. So they have a little bit of time given to them at university for this, but it's worth going in and checking. If you've got your meeting scheduled for a couple of days' time, it's worth going in and checking that they've done this, because you need to see what have they assessed themselves at? What have they said their key strengths and areas for improvement are? Then step 4 is when the student teacher and the mentor, you get together for the progress review and you review and discuss the student teacher's progress and targets. So that's a combination of reviewing the synthesis of progress and also reviewing their self-assessment. And then step 5, mentor, it's your job to complete the progress review form on the PLP, and we're going to show you what that looks like coming up. And this should reflect the outcomes discussed in the progress review meeting. So those are the 5 steps. Student teacher self-assesses, then they do their synthesis of progress. Mentor, you go in and you check those 2 things. You meet together and have that meeting and that discussion, and then you complete the form, the final progress review form, which reflects the outcomes. So here are the steps that the student teachers follow when they're completing the synthesis of progress. For KAP1, we ask them to identify 1 to 2 critical elements of pedagogy. So P1, P3, P6 and P9, in which the most progress has been made since the start of CP1. It would be a lot of information for them to reflect on every single element of the professional standards. So we ask them to target their reflection on the critical elements, so the things that are key to that key threshold. Then we ask them to identify the relevant critical elements of collaboration, professional learning, innovation and or leadership that helped them to improve the critical elements of pedagogy that they've identified. So what have they done in terms of collaboration that has supported them with P1, with managing the learning environment? Have they observed somebody? Have they asked for advice from somebody? How has that supported them? And then, using these prompt questions, they write a critical reflection. So what progress do they feel that they've made in the selected elements that they've chosen? And how do they know that they've made that progress? What is indicated to them that actually, I am making progress in assessment for learning? And how did these elements of collaboration, professional learning, innovation and or leadership influence their progress in pedagogy? So as I said earlier, they've got a bit of time in university to complete this synthesis of progress. But this is something that they should have done, they should have reflected on, and they will come to the meeting having prepared this, and you will also have read through this prior to the actual meeting. The aim of this is to prompt them to think more critically about their progress. So sometimes when they're doing their PGCE or their undergraduate programme, there's an awful lot of tasks that they have to complete. And they're kind of working through, they're planning their lessons, they're doing marking, they're joining in with activities and things. And actually their progress can sometimes be something that they get swept along by everything that they're doing. So we need them to take that moment to stop, to reflect on the professional standards, where they are, where they should be, where they've come from, where they're going, and actually think critically, what are my strengths? What are my areas for development? How do I know this? They can hyperlink to assets, so to evidence that enhance their reflection, but this isn't essential. So for example, if they want to link to examples of pupil work or lesson evaluations or research and inquiry log entries, that might be helpful. They might be saying, I feel that I've achieved PL1 because of this research and inquiry log that I did. So perhaps linking to that log might be helpful. We don't say that this is essential. They don't have to do that. And it might be that you're working very closely with your student teacher and you have lots of time for discussions at the beginning and end of school day. And you might know this already. You might know where they've shown evidence of this. So they might feel like, actually, my mentor knows that I did that. But it could be that they're going to link. There's a guide word count of 600 to 1,000 words, so that's roughly the amount of detail that we're looking for. And as I said, KAP1, it's only the critical elements that we ask them to reflect on. If you're thinking back to this when you're doing KAP2, 3 and 4, the only difference with the synthesis of progress is that they're not required to stick to the critical elements. So for this one, we say, yes, stick to the critical ones because those are the ones that we're assessing. As they move forward through their programme, they can reflect on whichever standards they feel they've made the most progress in or are their biggest targets. After they've done their synthesis of progress, there is a professional standards tracker on the PLP and they log the elements of the PSTL that they've referenced. So the aim is to cover a range of elements by the end of the PGCE or BA programme. They don't need to cover all of them, but we don't want every single progress review. They're looking at exactly the same standards. So we want to have a bit of a range by the end of the programme, but they don't need to cover all of them. So then we'll come to the progress review meeting. So before, they've done the synthesis of progress, they've done the tracker, and they've done their self-assessment. All elements of the PSTL are assessed in the progress review. So in a learning and teaching observation, it might be that there are certain standards that are not applicable. And also, we don't ask for you to comment on all things like collaboration and professional learning in a lesson observation, because you can't necessarily see those things in that lesson observation. In the progress review, we do say that every element needs to be assessed. So every single standard needs to have unaware, aware, capable QTS plus assessed against it. One thing that is so important is that it's a meeting that happens face-to-face between the mentor and the student teacher. This isn't something that can be done over email. This needs to be the mentor and the student teacher sitting down together in a room and having this conversation together. We have dates that are specified in the clinical practice guide for these meetings. If for some reason there's a reason why it can't happen in the particular week specified, talk to your senior mentor about it, because it would probably be preferable to delay it to the next week, the start of the next week, rather than for the meeting not to happen entirely. So it's really important that whatever's happening in school, whatever's going on, this meeting is really prioritised. The progress review is done with them, not to them. So the process has been designed so that it is a collaborative process. The student teacher has a chance to self-assess themselves and to share their thoughts on their progress and development. And then you as the mentor and the student teacher will get together and have a conversation together about their progress. It shouldn't feel like something that is imposed on them. The student teachers have got a voice. It's a collaborative effort. So it's important that you look at and centre your professional dialogue in the progress review meeting around that self-assessment and synthesis of progress. So obviously there might be things that hasn't come up in that progress review, in their synthesis of progress and their self-assessment, that you think, actually, it's really important that we talk about that. Of course you can talk about that, but make sure that you centre your discussions, at least at the start of the meeting, around their self-assessment, the synthesis of progress, because that is where we want the starting off point to be. And remember that their written and verbal reflections can actually reveal an awful lot about their behaviours and learning dispositions. So some of those standards in innovation, in professional learning, in collaboration, the way that they conduct themselves and they reflect on their progress can indicate whether they're working at unaware, aware or capable. So being really present and having that conversation and making time and space for that can actually help you with your assessments. And they've done some really thoughtful preparation work in their synthesis of progress. And we want to celebrate this as well, because we're hoping to set up habits that are going to support the student teachers with their reflection going forward into the profession a bit further as well. Everything that we're talking about, so the self-assessment, the synthesis of progress, and your mentor progress review, is all going to be on the PLP. And you're going to be shown where all of these things are in our live walkthrough in a minute. So to help you with having this meeting, we've got some professional dialogue prompts for progress reviews. So it could be that this is the very first time that you're doing this. It could be that you're thinking, Sian, I've done this a million times. Why are you telling me all of this? But hopefully these prompts are going to help you, especially if you're new to doing this progress review. A really good question to ask is, what did your practice look like before and after progress was made? So if a student teacher is saying, I really feel like I've made progress in my assessment for learning, what did it look like before you made this progress? And now what's the difference? So getting them to compare their practice before and after can be really helpful. What examples or artefacts of practice illustrate this? If you're in the meeting and the student teacher's saying something and you're thinking, that's interesting, I hadn't really noticed that before. Have they got anything that they could show you that would support you to understand why they feel they've made progress? Perhaps a lesson evaluation, perhaps a research and inquiry log. What steps did your mentor take to support your progress? So if you are the mentor doing this, how did you say that you made progress in this particular subject area? How do you feel that our planning meeting helped you make progress in this area? What steps did you take to support your progress? Have you done anything that I'm not aware of? Or have you done anything that you'd like to illustrate in here that supported you with that progress? What research and inquiry activities supported your progress? How did other areas of the standard support progress in this element, e.g. collaboration, professional learning? Perhaps they had a meeting with the elenco and that's really helped them with their differentiation. It would be useful for the student teacher to be able to articulate the fact that that meeting then informed their practice, which supported them with making progress. So now I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to do a live demonstration of the progress review form on the PLP.
So here we are on the landing page of the PLP, and I'm going to take you through a walkthrough of completing Progress Review Form 1 for KAP1, Key Assessment Point 1. So you're going to find your way to the Assessment tab. You're going to click on the drop-down menu. Now, in your preparations for completing the Progress Review meeting and the Progress Review form, you're going to want to have a look at the student teacher's synthesis of progress. This will have been covered previously in this session, so I'm not going to go through this too much or dwell on it, but that's where you'll go to have a look at what the student teacher has written. And then you're going to find your way to progress reviews, and you can see that there are 4 in total. Across clinical practice 1 and 2. You've got other elements of the drop-down menu that are going to be useful to you, such as guidance, professional standards, the STEEL descriptors in the continuum of effective practice. Now, I like to have those top 2 there open in separate tabs because what you won't find embedded in each of the forms is a description of what P1 stands for, what P9 stands for. So you might want to have that open so that you can refer to it if you're unsure. And then we've got the language also of the STEEL descriptors, what we mean by unaware, what we mean by aware. Now, of course, considering the fact that this is Progress Review 1, you're probably going to be looking quite carefully at the descriptors for unaware and aware. It's not unheard of for there to be capables in the student teacher's profile at this early stage, but it's highly unlikely, I would say, at this early stage because, we're looking at a student teacher that is mainly independent if they're capable. And by Progress Review 1, they really haven't been with you for too long or in the classroom for too long. So having those 2 tabs open is going to be quite beneficial to you. So then you're going to find your way to Progress Review 1. Something else that is going to be of use to you here is you can see that we've got the key assessment point thresholds, the KAP thresholds. And it's worth just reminding yourself before you do each Progress Review form of what that threshold is. You're going to need to know that because if the student teacher's outcomes do not meet that particular threshold, then concern over progress should be followed as a process, and you'll get lots of support from your senior mentor if that is the case. So familiarise yourself with the appropriate CAP point and CAP thresholds. You've got the descriptor for Progress Review 1 there. And then you're going to go to the student details part of the form. Now, you'll have space to complete all of the sort of obligatory information about the student teacher, their name, the lead partnership school that they're attending. They can let you know that if you're unsure, if you're a clinical practice school. Their number, again, they can let you know this if necessary, where they're on placement right now, the programme they're on. You'll get a drop-down menu there. What key assessment point this is. We know that this is KAP1, your name, your email address, and the date that you completed it. Now, the other thing to look at, as well as the student teacher synthesis of progress before you get going completing the form, and certainly you're going to want to have met with the student teacher before you finalise this form, is the student teacher's progress review themselves. So they are required to self-assess against all elements of the standards and to indicate where they think that they are. Remember that this process should be done with them, not to them. And you can see that this student teacher has already indicated some of their outcomes on the form. So you'll be able to have a look at those. And in the progress review meeting itself, perhaps you're going to need to have a conversation where there is maybe a conflict between your opinion and the student teacher's opinion for whatever reason. But I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but important to have a look at that before completing the form and before you have the progress review itself. So then we've got your bit of the progress review form. Again, you've got a place to fill in the student's name. And then if I just give you another couple of pro tips that you'll hear me say in many of these walkthrough videos again and again, but worth repeating, we've got a button in the top left here, Assessor Field Actions, 2 options to save and release the entire form. If you save and release, the student teacher will be able to see, read, know all about that form and the outcomes. Now, if you're halfway through doing the form, you're not going to want to save and release it. So at that stage, you're going to want to save and hold it, and that will save and hold all aspects of the form that you've completed up to that point. You do also have the option for every single part of the form to save and hold or save and release as you go. You do what works best for you, but I would recommend at the very end that you use this top button for save and release, because what we found in the past is that some aspects of the form haven't been released if you've been doing it sort of manually, working your way down through the form. And we draw down the data from these progress review forms. That's really important for us in terms of tracking the student teacher's progress. And also, if it's not saved and released, more importantly, the student teacher won't be able to see it. So really important to remember. So the format of this form kind of follows the same pattern, really. You will be asked to give an outcome for all 32 elements of the standards, because remember that the progress review is capturing the student teacher's progress overall at that particular moment in time. So do need to set aside a bit of time to do this form well, to do this form thoroughly. So you'll get a bank of elements from each of the 5 standards. Here we've got the first 5 elements from pedagogy, and you've got the option to indicate or the opportunity to indicate the student teacher's outcomes. We do need you to give an outcome for every single element of the standards. You're then going to need to indicate for any critical elements of the standards. So for this little bank from pedagogy, we've got P1 and P3, which are both critical elements of the standards, which have to be met at a particular point on the continuum of the student teacher's development, depending on the CAP threshold. This being KAP1, Progress Review 1, the student teacher is expected to be at a minimum of aware for P1 and for P3 for managing the learning environment and for assessment. And you can see that hypothetically this student actually has not met P3 at aware. And so here, if I was this student teacher's mentor, I would be indicating a check for P1 because they have met P1 at the threshold, at the outcome needed for that threshold. However, I would leave P3 blank because they have not. And this is just sort of a belt and braces approach, really, for mentors, senior mentors and university to be able to identify where and in what areas the student teacher is not managing to quite hit the threshold at that particular point in time. So really important that you do that. And then following the pattern of this form, you've got the outcomes, and then you've got the opportunity to provide qualitative comments, areas of strength with regard to those elements that you've just graded, and priorities for future development. We'll talk a lot about what we're looking for from those qualitative comments. I will say here that you don't need to comment on absolutely every element, and really just thinking about the most pertinent areas of strength to highlight and the most pertinent priorities that are going to help to take the student teacher forward and help them to work towards the next progress review and really move their practice on. So then we've got exactly the same again for the next cluster of elements from the pedagogy standard. You'll indicate the student teacher's outcomes. You'll notice that there's a little asterisk again that sort of indicates where we've got critical elements of the standards. P6 and P9 are critical elements. And again, check the boxes if the student teacher has met that particular element at the threshold indicated in the KAP thresholds. Again, we've got qualitative comments, areas of strength, and priorities for future development. And now you're probably getting to the swing of it, and you can see how this form is a little bit repetitive, but really important that we get that big picture view of how the student teacher is progressing. So then we've got the final 6 elements of pedagogy. You'll indicate the outcomes, you'll provide qualitative commentary, strengths and areas for development. And then we're into our next standard, which is collaboration. So we've got fewer elements here to indicate outcomes for. Again, we've got a rubric. You're going to indicate the outcomes at this point in time on the rubric. You're going to check the box if they've met it at the correct threshold. And then we've got a place to give qualitative comments. And so on and so forth. We get into professional learning, same process, select the outcomes, check the boxes, leave the qualitative feedback. We've got the 3 elements of innovation. And then we've got the 4 elements of leadership. Okay, so you're probably starting to get a sense of why you're going to need to set aside a bit of time to work on this, particularly if this is the first time that you are completing a progress review form. Really, take the time to familiarise yourself with it before you get going. And then once you've done all of that really good work, you've got a couple of extra bits that we like you to complete at the end of the form. We do ask that you complete all aspects of the form. Please check back before saving and releasing and make sure that you've completed all aspects of the form. So here we like to track, monitor and provide support where necessary with regard to student teachers, personal literacy, numeracy, digital competence and Welsh. And so you've got the opportunity to indicate how they're doing by using these drop-down menus. So if the student teacher shows good levels of competence in their personal literacy, then you're going to select accordingly. If you select requires improvement, we'll be able to monitor that. It might be that you flag that to your senior mentor and that they can get a little bit of extra support in those areas. Same for numeracy, same for digital competence. So you're going to indicate the student teacher's outcomes on all of those skills. And then we've got a place for you to log any absences that the student teacher has had from school at that point. Remember that they should be keeping an attendance log, which is also on the PLP. You can see the attendance record is there. So log any absences to date on the paperwork there. And then we've got 2 really important questions. Is the student teacher upholding the code of conduct? So you're thinking about their professionalism here. Now there is a link to the code of conduct under the guidance section of the assessment tab, and you're providing a yes or no outcome. Now if they are not upholding the code of conduct, that means that there is a concern over progress. It's really important if you do select that they are not upholding the code of conduct that you speak to your senior mentor. Likewise, you've got a box here to indicate if the student teacher is causing you concern. Now, a couple of things here. If they're not upholding the code of conduct, then there is a concern, and the concern of a progress process will need to be initiated, and you'll need the senior mentor to work with you to help you with that process. Furthermore, if the student teacher has not met the threshold, and you'll know this because you will perhaps not have checked some of the boxes for the critical elements of the standard, so just really keep an eye on how, to what extent they've met the threshold. If they haven't met the threshold, even if it's just one element that they haven't met at the correct threshold, then you must select that there is concern over progress and flag it up with your senior mentor straight away. Better that we know sooner rather than later, so we can put some interventions, some support in place to help that student teacher make that progress. So that's the form. It is a bit longer. I think it will take a bit longer than the learning and teaching observation forms, and it will take a little bit longer if you're new to it, but you'll soon get into your stride. And remember that it's very important that you have that all-important progress review conversation with your student teacher, so that when you release this form, once the form is written and sent to the student, there are no nasty surprises. These should all be the things that, the outcomes that you've already discussed with them. Best of luck with it.
Okay, so now we have some examples to help you through this process, some practical examples. So on the screen, what you'll see is a screenshot of the first 5 elements of the standards. And this is an example of a good form which has been completed. And what we'd like you to focus on is the fact that the outcomes have been indicated for all the elements of the standards. So Sharon referred to in this key assessment point that we are making a judgment on all of the elements of the standards. So all of the boxes need to be clicked and ticked. If the student is unaware, then you will obviously click that box and aware as appropriate. So we can see that here. What we can also see is that underneath this particular section, there is a sort of a bolts and braces approach, just to make sure that everybody is familiar with the fact that P1 and P3 are critical elements of the standards. So please ensure that you check these boxes if they are appropriate. Obviously, your student teacher might not have met the threshold for aware in P1, therefore you will not tick that box. But if it is aware, then make sure they align with the judgments that you've indicated in the drop-down boxes. Sometimes, however, teachers, mentors forget to tick all the elements of the standards. So just a reminder that needs to be completed. And again, make sure that you indicate the threshold boxes, that they are ticked appropriately in accordance with your judgments. There is another misalignment that can take place, and that is that mentors sometimes could judge or consider in their discussions that a student teacher is unaware in a standard, but inadvertently clicks the aware box underneath. So just when you're completing the form, just another little check and a little reminder to make sure that these align. And here you can see a slight misalignment because in the discussions it's been established that the student teacher is unaware in P1, and yet P1 has been indicated as having passed. If we think more specifically about the written feedback that takes place, an example here shows an example of good feedback where the mentor is cross-referencing the language to the elements of the standard. So you can see indications here of P1 and P3. You'll also notice that the feedback reflects the language of the STIL descriptors. We have language such as increasingly positive, developing, becoming effective. And that allows triangulation with the outcomes of unaware and aware, which have been previously discussed in this session. Sometimes feedback can be fairly brief and perhaps ambiguous, which can be confusing for our student teacher. The feedback may also not be cross-referenced to the elements of the standards. And once again, cross-referencing the elements of the standards is vital for the student teacher's understanding of their progress. And finally, sometimes it doesn't reflect the language of the STIL descriptor. So as a mentor, you might, in your discussions with your student teacher at this KAP, Key Assessment Point 1, you might have established that a student teacher is unaware,
but you might have indicated in your language that the student teacher is making good progress. Therefore, there's a misalignment, and that can become confusing for the student teacher. If we look here at some written feedback around feeding forward and priorities for future development, again, we have a similar pattern. We have feedback which is cross-referenced to the elements of the standards, and in this case, P2. We also have feedback, again, which reflects the language of the STIL descriptors, so that will support the students on their journey. And finally, the feedback is constructive, so it is giving clear advice for improvement. If we look at one which is perhaps not so successful in prioritising future development, what you'll notice is, again, the feedback is brief and fairly ambiguous, that it's not cross-referenced to the elements of the standards. Again, there's lack of that language of the STIL descriptor. And the feedback in this case is not constructive. So it's just differentiation needs work. That is not really going to support the student teacher in their journey moving forward. How are we going to help them? What guidance and how are they going to improve? So just to sort of conclude, we do have some top tips for progress reviews. So it's really important in this discussion that you have with your student teacher that you personalise your feedback to things that are important to your student teacher's development. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Looking at particular areas of strength and focusing on particular areas for development for the future. In this key assessment point, you will need to grade every standard, but we realise that this is very, very time consuming and we value your time, and therefore you don't need to comment on every standard. You should be using an appropriate descriptor when referring to the specific standard. So if you are talking about managing the learning environment, you should be citing P1 as that particular reference to the standards, and you should be consistent with the approach that you do. You should be mindful of the progress review thresholds as previously discussed. If you go to the clinical practice guide, which has been outlined, you will see quite clearly, highlighted in yellow, that at key assessment point 1, we require the students to be aware in the 10 critical standards. It is really important to remember this is a process which is done with the student teacher. It is a collaboration. It is a reciprocal conversation which the student teacher has spent time preparing in their synthesis of progress. So in that conversation, take time to find out why the student has graded themselves in the way that they have. Discuss any discrepancies. Of course, it is your judgment that stands finally, but take that time to discuss with them. Because on occasions, the student teacher might share something with you that may affect your decision. It might be that they have done some research and inquiry that you're not aware of that actually would support the judgment being aware rather than unaware. So do encourage them to adjust the targets also on your student teacher's synthesis of progress, but you also might need to adjust your judgments if necessary. But as mentioned, it is your grading that is ultimately the final decision. Sometimes this will be a straightforward conversation where the views of your student teacher and you align. And sometimes this conversation may be slightly more tricky, but that is why, therefore, it is important that you take the time to read their synthesis of progress and understand why they have judged themselves in a certain way. And finally, we do have some other useful resources, some video resources to support you in this process. So if you go to www.youtube.com/@CP Mentors, you will find a suite of videos to help you in this key assessment review. Finally, there are some other useful video resources on a different YouTube channel, and this time you will find them at www.youtube.com/CP youtube.com/@shared_understanding. And these videos are designed to allow you to understand an understanding of the standards as the student teacher journeys between unaware to aware, capable and beyond. So these videos again may be useful in this process. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you for all the work that you do with our student teachers and your ongoing support in this process. Diolch yn fawr iawn.